We've spent all our time in this section just building and building, and you've yet to even pull a fader up, hear any audio, and really get started on the mix. So the logical conclusion is that we must be reaching some kind of grand climax, some kind of crescendo here where I'm going to drop this huge nugget of wisdom that's going to shift your paradigm. It's going to change the way you think about music forever. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to let you guys all down here because mixing, the actual process of mixing, is not as complicated as I think 95% of the tutorials out there make it seem. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. And what we're really focused on is a starting place, a place from which all of the additional processing is going to happen. Okay, and what does that involve? It involves volume and pan. So with volume and pan, what we're doing here, like I just said, is setting a relative balance from which all future choices, at least within the mix, are going to be made. The oldest tools in the book, the volume fader, the pan pot, really remain the biggest difference makers. Or what I really should say here is the simplest of tools, the tools that have been around the longest, the things that you don't need anybody to explain to you, turning up the volume, you know what that does. Turning the pan pot, you know what that does. Those tools ultimately are going to dictate every decision that you make moving forward, and really, more than anything else, determine what's happening in your mix. Okay? So when you think about it, and when you're listening to music nowadays, that relative volume and where things are located in the stereo field, there's things you can do to try to enhance that after you've placed them there, but you have to place them there first. And that really sets the stage for everything that's to come. And you could very easily get away with mixing using just volume faders and pan positions. Yeah, you might need to do like a crap ton of automation on the volume fader in particular, but you could get away with it. And for a long time, that was kind of how mixing was done. And even before the console came into the studio, how was mixing done? It was done by just arranging people around a microphone. If somebody's further back, they sound more distance in terms of the frequency spectrum that's picked up. You can hear more of the room. You get that kind of reverb effect, and they're also quieter. You put somebody right in front of the microphone, they sound like they're right in your lap, right in the living room. There's very little reverb, just, some early reflections. The frequency response is slightly different, and they're louder. And that is really like mixing 101. And mixing 101 involves microphone placements. And when you think about microphone placements in relationship to the mixing in the computer, it makes things a lot easier. Because if you can just imagine a stage with all of your parts there arranged however they are, like orchestration, okay? Some of you guys know what orchestration is, right? Like how the conductor is going to arrange everybody on stage for a performance. That's ultimately what you're doing, and you don't need a whole lot more than volume and pan. The other processors that we're going to look at, the stuff that people spend 99% of the time talking about, is really the cherry on top, so to speak. It's enhancing that further so that things kind of come together. But still, at the end of the day, volume and pan, that's what determines everything. And this is why listening with that fresh perspective, making sure that you've done the preparation in advance, is so important, because your ears can deceive you, and you can spend an entire day mixing a song only to come back the next day realizing that you were fatigued for most of it and everything sounds way out of whack. Okay, mixing is not that difficult as long as you have a critical ear, a fresh ear, and you're hearing everything with as much detail as possible. So just a couple of examples here, or one big example, I should say. Imagine setting the lead vocal very quiet and pan slightly to the left, with the shaker element being the loudest thing and in the center. This would have a huge impact on what the listener hears, perceives, and judges as the most important element. In the above example, they may assume a mistake has been made. But then again, maybe that was your intention. And thus, the next slide is indeed titled Intention and Interpretation. So when it comes to mixing, and the way we're looking at mixing, all it is just a matter of personal taste. So as you're listening to all the parts, you are going to decide this is most important, this should be the loudest and in the center. This is maybe not so important. I'm going to put it in the background, and maybe I'm going to pan it slightly to the left. Okay, this part, it's important at this time, but at this other time, it's not important. Let me automate the volume on that. Bring it in so that at a certain point in the song, it really becomes the prominent feature. Okay, that is all up to your own personal taste. Now, in the modern day and with professional mixing, emulation is kind of the big thing. And that's what you end up hearing more of. And that's what a lot of the tutorials and discussions are about. Mainly because what we really like as human beings, not only with our music, but just in general, is sameness, comfort, and convention. If you break convention on a, let's say, a song that you're shooting for the top 40 on, unless you break that convention so far that it elicits a lot of interest, that song is going to fail. And this is why everything sounds very similar for particular genres of music. That being said, at some point, someone was sitting behind that console and was mixing to their taste. And maybe they weren't mixing to taste, but they were mixing to direction of make this as loud and as bright as possible because that is what people enjoy. That is what they are going to end up buying. If this is louder than that, they're going to want this. Right. So that is an element to it. But at some point, it did come down to that one person's taste. And now a lot of people just kind of sit down and try to emulate that as a means of making sure that their mix is going to be competitive, specifically within the same sort of genre. I listened to a song fairly recently where they actually did take the lead vocal and kind of shifted it off to the left. There was nothing going down, the main channel, so to speak. Everything was panned either left or right. There was nothing smack dab in the middle. And when I read through the comments, it was really surprising to me that everybody was saying the track was way out of balance to the left. And in reality, it wasn't out of balance to the left. There was enough stuff on the right to kind of even things out, but it was because the lead vocal was over there and everybody felt like the song was tilted, that there had been a big mistake made. And unfortunately, in that example, in the song that I heard, I think it kind of failed because they didn't break convention far enough. Instead, people just interpreted that as a mistake, and they're not going to come back and probably listen to it again. Now, this course is about making music and having fun doing it. Okay, and if you're brand new to this too, you need to mix to your taste first. You need to get your feet wet, kind of hear what it is that you enjoy in these tracks, and go off of instinct, not off of emulation, comparing yourself to someone else's work who has years and years of experience and who's worked with a lot of processors, who knows what it is they're going for before they even sit down to do it. It's a totally unfair playing field. That being said, I might mix a track, you might mix the same track, we swap them, we listen. Who's to say that I'm not going to like what you did more? And that's what really makes mixing, I think, so much fun. It's like this totally open plane where everything has kind of been put there, but you have to, kind of arrange things in such a way that is sonically pleasing to you. So you determine what the listener focuses on based on your own interpretation of the stems that you've been given with the mix that you create. And for this reason, in my opinion, there's really not such a thing as a objectively good or objectively bad mix. Really, it's just my interpretation versus yours based on how we've executed our intention. So as an example here, do you want the guitar to be bright and in focus, right down the middle, slamming you in the face? Or would you prefer for that guitar part to be dark? Maybe it's in the background. Sometimes you hear it, sometimes you don't. It's kind of drifting between the left and the right channel. And this is entirely up to you and your taste. So it comes back to, right, mixing to your taste. Now, here's where it gets a little bit, muddy. It's not that clear cut. Because for me, if your idea was to make sure that you wanted to do the second thing with that guitar, and you end up not being able to accomplish that, it doesn't do that, it sounds way too bright, or it's not really moving in and out of the track, and there are times when it comes in and it sounds weird, you haven't been able to execute your intention. And then from your viewpoint, specifically your viewpoint, you might then view that part in relation to the rest of the track as being bad or not being successful. That being said, again, I could listen to it and really love it. So I think when you're talking about good or bad, you have to relate that to what it is you're trying to do. So your intention, and then ultimately how you're able to execute that. And I also want to just throw this in here because I think this is an interesting component that people don't always recognize with professional music, is that it's not uncommon for a track that you hear on the radio to have been mixed by a variety of engineers before a producer or a record label head or whoever ultimately, is usually sitting in the office smoking their cigar, just counting their stacks of money, picks a favorite. Or in this case, really, they're kind of picking what they think is going to sell the best. But ultimately, that comes down to their interpretation or of what they believe the common listener is going to view as the best. So all of the people who've mixed the track are professionals. They all know what they're doing. They've all probably done a phenomenal job on it. But at the same time, ultimately only one gets chosen. And I think for this reason, attempting to critique a mix on good or bad is fairly useless because you're basing that judgment entirely on your own taste or possibly entirely on what you believe to be conventional, what is the same for you, what compares to what you've heard in the past, and what's ultimately comfortable and something pleasing to listen to. So now we move on to the approach. And I want to make this crystal clear that this is my own approach to mixing. I don't mix every day. I'm not a professional mix engineer in any way, shape, or form. I never plan to be. But I thought it would be useful to at least kind of tell you the way that I get started. And you're more than welcome to do it this way or not do it however you want to do it. But the way I like to start is I, put some kind of safety on the master, and we'll look at this in an example in a minute. I play everything back. I check to see, first of all, I play it back muted, and I check to see where everything is lining up in terms of where it's peaking out on the meter. And at that point, if I need to go in and adjust clip gains, I go in and adjust clip gains to make sure that everything is giving me at least 6 dB or so of headroom to work with, even when I'm at unity gain. And at that point, I will play the track. I'll listen to it, and then I try to pick out what I believe are the most important elements. From there, I solo out the most important elements and choose what I believe to be most important, and then I bring it up to a level that's, -6 or -3 dB. And normally with the most important element too, you're not going to be panning that. So that's the thing you want straight down the middle. And at that point, it's just a matter of then continuing to set balances and bringing things in based on their perceived importance. So as you're listening, you'll say, okay, this seems like the next important thing. Let me make sure I bring that in next. So by mixing up against what's the most important element, you'll be able to keep that element as the most important thing the whole way through. And this is why it's common for people to mix up against a vocal. So, you bring the vocal in first, and then you make sure that everything sits nicely with it. On the flip side, some people will bring everything in first and then bring the vocal in last to guarantee that. But I like to go based on the level of perceived importance because it gives me a direction at all times. And I can then really kind of get those balances and make sure everything is working nicely throughout the entire track. So as an example, I just said this, let's say the most important element is the lead vocal. By mixing everything against that, you can make certain that it remains the most important thing by bringing everything else in relative to it. So that's just my approach. It's not the only way to do it, but that's the way I like to do it. And it's always given me good results. May work for you, may not. Since this presentation is all about volume and pan, let's just quickly talk about a little bit of like balance theory, so to speak. This stuff is straightforward, but it is something you want to keep in the back of your mind while you're making these volume and pan position choices. For something to be loud, there needs to be something quiet. You need that relation. You need to put everything into context. For a song to be in stereo, there has to be some kind of imbalance between what's happening in the left speaker, what's happening in the right speaker. So you take that guitar, you pan it slightly to the left, you take that oboe, you pan it slightly to the right. Now suddenly you have a song that's in stereo, even if those two parts individually are mono, right? You're throwing that balance kind of out of whack. So now the listener is noticing that, oh, okay, I can hear that there's more guitar in the left, something along those lines. So the real question that you're asking yourself then from more of a macro level, from top down, is how do you want to try and tip this balance scale? Do you want to go with an even approach? An example here is that if you have something hard left, you're going to have something hard right. You're always thinking about balance and making sure that it all sounds cohesive at the end, so nothing really sticks out of place. And this is more of a professional approach that relies on typical convention. This is what you hear in so much pop music and also in like dance music, because you have really wide synths anyway. So like you have to think that tracks you have that are already in stereo are approached a little bit differently, because if you pan those to the left or right, sometimes it actually takes away from the stereo effect of things. So do keep that in mind as well as we talk about balance. Do you want to go with an uneven or an imbalance? A couple of examples here. You place more emphasis on the sides, so you have more stuff in stereo. You use like those width controls. Really interesting effect if you only have, for example, vocals and bass, and maybe the kick drum as well, directly down the center, and everything else is like gradually being pushed wider and wider. It's a crazy way to kind of work on a mix, and it doesn't work then when you try to translate it back to mono, or it can get really crowded, but it's a fun thing to do if you know that your listeners are going to be in headphones or are not going to be listening to the song in mono. Another idea of throwing things out of whack going with an imbalance, I should say, is making what would normally be really loud, kind of maybe bringing that down and having a different element take the place of that. And, a really obvious example to this is normally when you have a drum kit, the hi-hat is like the quietest or more of a backing element. But in certain forms of hip hop and like trap music, sometimes the hi-hat is like the loudest freaking thing. So that is not a normal convention, but it's become that way as that music has been mixed in that style. Or in terms of balance, do you want to go out of whack? An example here, 2 parts are super loud down the middle and everything else is very quiet and panned all over the place, devoid of complete convention. So if you want to bust the kitchen sink, you're more than welcome to bust the kitchen sink. In fact, I kind of encourage it because from my point of view, especially here at the Sormena project, we are all people trying to make music, and I think we have more of an open ear to listening to different things. And if you give me a traditional pop mix and you also give me a mix that's way out of whack, I'm going to get enjoyment out of listening to both of those. And the thing that's out of whack is actually going to make me listen closer. If you're worried about sales, if you're worried about sounding professional, then you do want to go with the first approach. And that's totally okay. Again, this is all about mixing to taste. So when you are mixing to taste, if it sounds like things that you hear on the radio or that you hear on iTunes or whatever, that's great. It means that you enjoy the way that sounds and you're able to replicate it. And people spend a long, long time trying to get there, and thus all the tutorials and magazines and books that exist out there on mixing, when really it's not that complicated. It's a lot simpler than people want to make it seem. And speaking of which, trust your taste. Always trust your taste. Don't second guess your instincts. When you begin to second guess yourself, especially with balances, okay, you are going to throw everything out of whack. Because let's say that you've set your balances, you start to get to work on adding in some additional effects processors. If you go back and then you change a balance, even slightly, what has that done? It has changed the relative balance with that instrument to every other instrument, in which case you then start going back and like chasing your tail and moving things around. Sometimes, yes, small moves are made because the processor has changed the relative loudness, or it's changed like the pan position slightly if you're using a stereo effect. And in those cases, then yes, you will change things, but you're changing it to then make sure that it fits with where you had it before. So I know there are certain standards for certain genres of music, but don't necessarily follow them unless you really believe and hear, as you're working on your mix, that it's the best way to go about it. Mixing in an unconventional way may turn some listeners off, but may garner the interest of others. Professionally, the goal is to appeal to the lowest common denominator, and that is something that when we get to the Mixing Perspectives course, we will spend a lot of time talking about. We're not going to spend a ton of time on techniques in that course because you should already know them, in which case it becomes more important to think about how you're approaching your mix versus just the technical elements. But for us, we're still kind of learning some of those technical elements here. But with a professionally mixed track, what's the end goal? To increase sales. And so if the goal is to increase sales, you need to make sure that whatever your largest percentage of listeners are who are potentially going to be buying the track, you want to make sure that you make them happy first and everybody else kind of comes second. So if the biggest audience is teenage boys and girls who are listening on, for example, like Apple iPod headphones, you should actually probably spend a lot of time mixing on those Apple iPod headphones, guaranteeing that they are going to have a fantastic experience listening to that song. I know that sounds kind of crazy, especially for people who've invested so much money into their system and their setup, but ultimately, that's what works the best because you are appealing to the people who are most likely going to be buying the track. So my next thing here with trust your taste is you want to make sure that you hear everything, but not at the expense of losing the focal point or losing what I call the most important element. So what this means is, as you're setting your balances here, just because maybe you lose a part of a track, for example, like something gets lost as you're listening back through it, don't panic right away and crank everything up to deal with that. Because by doing that, you might then actually blur the balance that you've set. It's fine if after you set your initial balance, if there are some serious gaps or if you feel like things are too far apart, that's actually a good thing because with the techniques we're going to be working with, the whole point of that is to try to bring things a little bit closer together. It's like adding that final coat of varnish, to cover up some of the blemishes or some of the mistakes that you've made beforehand. So that's why I wrote, it's totally fine to lose some of the subtleties and details for now. Last but not least, mix with a purpose, meaning just trust your taste. If you feel like this is where that element goes, put it there and leave it and just move on to the next thing. The more time you spend listening and second guessing, the faster your ears are fatiguing. And that's really kind of the enemy that we're trying to fight against is our own ears and how fast they're fatiguing and impacting our judgment. So again, volume and pan, these are the foundation. It's the foundation to all multi-track mixing. It's not about the processors you have. It's not about, what you do in terms of putting things on the master bus or working in parallel. And again, what 99% of the tutorials are out there discussing, volume and pan, most important thing, determines how you're going to move forward. We all know that it's fun to use a bunch of plugins, but volume and pan are ultimately dictating the listener's focus. It's always been that way. It always will be that way. And this sets the tone and direction for you to follow the rest of the way through the mixing process. And I think this is very similar and analogous to ice cream and toppings. Who cares if you get sprinkles if the ice cream is terrible or fundamentally screwed up? You want the ice cream to be good first, and the toppings, they might cover things up for a while, and you're like, oh yeah, this is still really good. I got the little like Oreo bits on top. I've got a little bit of, chocolate sauce and every sprinkle and little candy bar bits. But then, as that mix of the ice cream to toppings, you're getting closer to the bottom of the bowl, you suddenly are feeling very unsatisfied and probably with a stomach ache, and you don't want to leave your listeners with a stomach ache or an earache. So plugins and processors, yeah, they can take mixes to next levels, but what it really relies on is you following your instincts when you're setting this first initial balance, volume, and pan. So last but not least, you really just want to experiment and have fun. Anyone can do this. Anyone can do this. Volume and pan, not that difficult. What's most important is having that direction and trusting your instincts. You can tell the story however you want to tell it. And again, there's no rule against mixing the same song multiple times if you want to go in different directions. So you're not limited to just mixing a song once, especially in the computer. You can do it as many times as you want, and it can go pretty quickly. And so it's fun sometimes to say, I'm going to play by the rules. I'm going to do something conventional. And then another time, do something that's absolutely crazy and just totally out of whack. And then you'll be able to sit down and listen to those two and compare and contrast and say, wow, how could I get such a different story out of one mix versus another? That's the part of mixing that I think I enjoy the most. So maybe I'm being a little bit biased by throwing that last bullet in there. But if you want, definitely do mixes a few different times. And I think at the end of this, when I sit down or when you sit down and listen to the variations on mixes of either the tracks I'm providing or tracks that you guys put up, it's going to amaze you at the variety that just the same stems can ultimately give you. And that comes down to people's taste, and we're all different. And so we all listen to music differently. Really cool, really fun. That's what Sormena is all about. This slide here is a little bit more of a guideline. I wrote don't touch the faders. And again, this is another personal opinion. Mix engineers are a lot more likely to automate and mess with their faders. People who make music producers, so to speak, at least me in particular, I do not like touching the faders once I've set the balances. So the reason for this, and we're going to look at it in an example, but once you start automating those faders, what happens if you need to make a balance change? You have to like go into the automation, grab all the points, bring everything up relative. I just don't like doing that. I've never felt comfortable automating faders for this reason. And so if you are going to be doing volume automation or pan automation, this actually may best be served using the built-in utility device inside of your program. This way, you can always return to the top level fader and pan pot without having to worry about deleting or moving that top level automation. Okay, so if that doesn't make sense to you right now, we're going to go into a couple of examples here. And after going through those, I think this is all going to make more sense to you. Let's take a look at two quick examples to put some of the stuff that we've been talking about in the presentation into a bit of a visual reference for you. The first thing I want to mention is that I'm not going to let you hear anything in this first example because I don't want to throw off your judgment when you're sitting down and potentially mixing this track. So with a lot of mixing tutorials, you watch somebody go through and kind of set all of their relative levels and make all of their decisions. I want you to make those decisions on your own. So I'm not going to show you or let you hear anything that I'm doing, especially not on the first go around of this course. In terms of some examples and putting things into perspective in an actual mix, if some of you guys decide to upload a mix or you're willing to give me access to the stems, I might in a bonus section later on go through a lot of the videos that we're doing here without being put in the context of a mix and putting it in the context of a mix so you can actually hear some examples. But I don't want to do that for now because I don't want to throw off your judgment or throw off your perspective when you're going through and mixing this song. So the first thing I'm going to do, and it's the first thing we did when we were actually making our music as well, is I'm going to put on a loud max here. So during the mixing stage, it's actually fine to leave these at like 0, 0. And all this means is when the track is playing back or when you're mixing, if for any reason you have an over, this is going to catch it. When you're mixing the track specifically, you don't want to see any kind of gain reduction until possibly the very end if you're using the mix bus as a processor. And we will talk about that. But for this part now, for setting balances, you want to make sure that you're safe at all times and really kind of maybe giving yourself like a minus 3 or 4 sort of a ceiling. But you'll see why this comes in handy at the beginning. All right, so after I've done that, what I would do is I would just take my stems as I got them, as is. I would mute this, and I would actually do this as well if I was mixing something, and I would just let everything play back once. Now, when we made our stems, we already checked for this, but not everybody is so kind and so nice. And what will end up happening is sometimes you'll see some huge variations in terms of clip gain settings. And I like to kind of even those out from the beginning so that at the end of the day, I know that my faders are going to reflect the actual volume levels. And visually, for me, that's really important. So after the track is played through, I'd go in and say, okay, let's imagine that this was at like minus 20. I'd be like, oh crap, I need to go in here and I need to change the clip gain level right at the beginning, put everything into a nice kind of window. You know, it can even be a 10 or 15 dB range, but you just don't want anything really drastic or anything really crazy. In some cases, people will give you things that have all been normalized, and so everything is at the top, everything is coming out to like 0 on the fader. If that's the case, you're going to grab everything. So imagine that's me grabbing everything and turn everything down uniformly, sometimes by as much as like 10 dB. And the reason is because eventually you're going to be adding all of these things back together. And when you're adding in additional parts, it can have a cumulative effect. It can start to build up and you can start to approach 0 during your mix, which in some cases it's not too bad. In other cases, it can be really kind of catastrophic when you get to the end. So I always like to play it safe, but again, there's no right way or wrong way. After I've checked that and I've made any changes that I've needed to make to the clip gain, what I would do next is unmute it and play through the song again, listening closely to decide, is there something that is really important? What are the elements that are sticking out? And I might take a piece of paper and I might write those down. I might go in and I might actually say, okay, this guitar part B, this is the most exciting thing that's happening. Let's use the percussion loop since it's happening a lot of times. And I might go in here and say, I'm going to choose this and I'm going to make this red just so it stands out. Or in this example, I'd have to pick something that's not being used. But I would do that so I know when I do get started on the mix, that is what I want to start with. That is the element that I'm going to mix everything against. So after I've made that determination, after everything is played through, you'll probably also notice that this is going to peak out at the top, which is fine for now. I'm going to take all of my tracks collectively, like so, and I'm just going to take the volume and I'm just going to pull these all the way down to as low as they possibly go. We certainly can't hear minus 822 dB, so that is sufficient. And now the next thing I'm going to do is find a section. Let's say like this is the section here that I want. Make sure this is still muted. And I would play this back, and then I'd start to bring this element in here. Okay, and I would set it to a point where it was like, maybe somewhere around -6, -5, and that is what I'm going to mix everything to. So I'd have a few other things that were in this color. I would bring those in, mix it against it. So let's see, is there something else happening at the same time? We have this synth run thing happening. Sometimes it's useful to also set a loop for the different sections. I'd start bringing this guy in. I also might say, you know what, this is going to sound good if it's panned a little bit. And I just go through and I do that for every single element, every single track, setting my balances, going quickly, being confident with my decision, moving on to the next part. Always keeping in the back of my mind, what sort of balance am I going for? Am I doing something even? Am I doing something that's maybe a little bit avant-garde? Or am I going totally out of whack? All right, so that's my approach to getting started with setting my relative balances and really the starting point for my entire mix. This second example is going to start out pretty easy, and it's progressively going to become more and more complex. Remember, this is completely theoretical, but these are the sort of situations that you can run into when you're thinking about balance. Okay, so what I would recommend is that you watch this video a few times if you ever get confused, but hopefully this will all make sense to you and all of our talking about signal flow will pay off at this point. So here's the audio track that we're going to be working with here. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. Okay, so let's imagine that we want to mix this as the main element. So this is the most important part of the track. We have our drums here that we're going to be mixing relative to it. So let's start by just bringing this guy up. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. And so an issue is that we're already at like unity gain. We're at 0 and we're not even up to like -6 or -5. So I'm going to go in and add some clip gain here so I can now bring this down. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. Okay, so I'll be happy with that. I know this is much quieter. So -4 dB, this is our most important element. Let's now mix the drums in relation to it. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone. Dynamic, very dynamic. Okay, so a problem is that in the second half, this is clearly no longer the most important thing that's happening. So logically, what are we going to do? We're going to go and automate the fader. But we're going to run into some problems with that technique, and I will show them to you as we move forward. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone. Dynamic, very dynamic. Okay, so I've automated that in. But there's a problem. At the end, I actually needed it to go up by even more than whatever it was, the 9 dB or so. There's a maximum limit that this fader lets us extend to, and that maximum limit is +6. Now let's say, for example, our drum loop has been processed, or for some reason we've brought this down much quieter. We're working maybe at a lower level. Maybe things were getting kind of out of control. So everything's been brought down, and I need to bring the vocals down with it, or this little talking part needs to be brought down as well. If I try to bring this down, I can do it, but what you're going to notice here in the second half is that the automation is not going to respond to that. So let's bring this recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone, quite quiet. It's gone. Now we do have the option here to restore the automation control, which I'm going to click, but now it hasn't taken into account that decrease in volume that I want. So if we listen to it, it's going to be impossible for us. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone. So now everything is just completely out of whack. This is way too loud. I need to bring it down, but I can't bring it down using the fader. So this is really kind of the reason why I don't like to automate the fader, because if you do a lot of automation and things are going all over the place and suddenly there's a big balance change, you can't go in and adjust it from the fader. At least in this program, you can't do it. So what I would have to do in this example is go in, make sure that my automation is like clicking to some kind of point here, select all of the automation, and then bring it down together. So if I knew I needed to bring this down by like 4 or 5 dB, I could do it, or listen to this in context. Right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. And now you're realizing, well, this second half should still probably be a little bit louder, so let's add another automation point here and take all of these guys and bring them up relative. So you can see just how crazy and out of control this can get, and that's not what you want. So there are several alternatives that you can use. The most obvious and simple alternative to visualize is to go in here and use something like the tool device, and you are encouraged to use the built-in utility device with your program, mainly for this very reason. So what we can do now is set the relative balance, recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. So if I want, now I can take this guy here, this amplitude control, and I can automate that. So if we automate this, recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. I can go in and I can automate this part like so. And if you listen, this is actually a little bit loud. The balance is probably slightly off. But this time I have the ability to now move this fader, and it's going to keep in mind this automation that I've just done with the tool device. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. So as you can hear, this needs to probably be brought up a little bit more than it was, and I can go in here and I can just delete a bunch of these points and I can bring it up a little bit more to match it. And it's just such a simpler and more logical way of dealing with your final output faders if you are going to use tools to control the volume level. And this is really just a way of thinking about and considering signal flow. That's really all this is, because if you think about it, we could also, if we wanted to, not use this tool device at all and just go in here and go to the gain and just bring this up. Okay, so if we listen to it now, recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic. Dynamic. And now a big advantage to this process as well has to do with if we were to take this one step further and actually compress this, because let's say we want this to be the most important element all the way throughout. If we compress down these loud parts, we can actually bring the overall volume up and not have as much variation. So this is kind of like the best of both worlds. If we were to leave the tool here, and why don't we actually do both examples here, okay? I'm going to bring this down to start. And I'm going to begin by bringing in a dynamics processor. Okay, and I'm using this one, and you are not allowed to use the built-in one. And for my own mixes for the course, I'm not going to. I'm just showing you this because we get this great little graphic display to show you how much gain reduction is actually taking place. So if I use this dynamics device right here from the outset, and let's just put the ratio to something like 2.5, recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. Now watch the meter when it gets to the second half. Further away from the microphone. No gain reduction. A little bit further away from the microphone. Dynamic. Okay, so if I bounce this now, we'll see that this has brought things a little bit closer together, and we could go and we could bring this volume up like so. And now listen to it and set the balance. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone. But it's still not where it needs to be. The difference is still far too great. However, think about signal flow for a second. If we go back here to the original and we increase the clip gain, we will be increasing the gain going into the dynamics processor. So now watch what happens with this gain reduction meter. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. What are you seeing? You're seeing a lot more gain reduction take place in that second half, which means what? Which means that this should now be much more leveled out. I can bounce it. We can look at it and you can already see the huge difference. And now we can set this balance. Recording right on top of the microphone, close miking right on top. A little bit further away from the microphone and quite quiet. A little bit further away from the microphone and dynamic, very dynamic. So now we can go and we can add maybe just a touch more clip gain to this processed version, and we're keeping this now as the main element all the way throughout. Okay, so this might have been a little bit complex for you, but I hope you understand or start to see the benefit of where you maybe want to do your dynamics processing or your gain processing and automation. So I would probably never, at least personally, automate this fader, this final fader that's going to the master, because of the complications it provides if you want to go back and adjust it later. Similarly, if you are thinking about going into dynamics processors, you want to think about how varied your dynamics are from the get-go. With most parts, you would never have to do what we just did here. They're not going to be recorded so drastically where you need to make huge clip gain moves. But if you then want to go in and use something like a compressor and bring something into a range like we did here, you might need to adjust that clip gain. Or even if you want to go crazier, you could start to use the tool and think about what it means. And I'll just leave this one up to you guys. What it means to drive gain from the tool into the dynamics processor, especially if you were to automate it. And spoiler alert, it would be the equivalent of actually adjusting clip gain, because this is the first thing in the chain. But also what would then happen if you were to put a tool device afterwards and then automate that even further. So there's a lot of options. There's a lot of ways you can think about this. And really the sky's the limit here, especially when you're working inside of the computer. So just a couple of examples I thought might be helpful for you. Again, review this if you're confused. And if you're still confused, don't hesitate to ask questions. Like anything you want to do in life, the biggest thing is to try and to put yourself out there. So, mixing, volume, pan, not difficult. Have a go. You can set the relative balances once or do it again and again until you're happy. There's no rule that says you can only do this one time. You can load up the same session 6 different times and set those relative balances differently each time. Go back and choose your favorite. And that's A-okay, especially if you're new to this. But once you're happy with something, once you're happy with the relative balances, go with it and commit to it. One small change impacts every balance you've set. You wouldn't start making a pop song, get everybody in the studio, have started the recordings, and then suddenly decide to make an ambient soundscape after you've gone 75% of the way there. And really setting your volume and your pan is about 90%, in my opinion. That's really what determines where you're going, okay, especially when you're mixing. Remember, these balances set the stage for all the processing and decision making that's to come. So while it requires the least amount of technical skill, it makes the biggest impact on how a listener experiences a song. So if you keep remembering that last bullet point throughout the entire mixing process, I think it's definitely going to serve you in making mixes to your taste and having something that you can be proud of and want to showcase at the end of all this.